Well, hello there, everybody, and welcome back to my series on epistemology. We're going to go in more into depth on the Gettier problems, as I promised before. Now, in this lecture, we're going to cover a lot of heavy material, so give yourself some space to rewind the video and check some of the things that we discussed that you may be a little unclear on. But let's go back and review a bit. The JTB Theory of Knowledge, we said, is the idea that knowledge occurs when you have a justified true belief. Now, this is a nice, clean theory, but what is the problem with that? The problem is, in a word, is this gentleman, Edmund Gettier, who in 1963 in one of his papers seems to have demonstrated that justification, truth, and belief are not sufficient by themselves to give a person knowledge. We went through in a previous lecture some of his counterexamples to the JTB theory. One involved Smith and Jones in the job hunt, and another one that we studied was Smith and Jones in Barcelona, a situation in which a person comes to believe that either Jones owns a Ford or he is in Barcelona. Turns out to be right and perfectly justified in his view, but he doesn't know what's going on. And we also took a look at Keith Lehrer's example of Nogot and Havit, just for fun. Now, in that previous lecture, we also examined a possible solution or a remedy to the JTB theory. What we said was that the agents in question started out with some type of false belief that they did their reasoning from. The false belief that Jones will get the job in the first situation, or that Jones owns a Ford in the second one, or that Nogot owns a Ford in the Lehrer example. So we took a look at the possibility that maybe all we need is a new rule. Maybe knowledge occurs when JTB is satisfied, plus the belief in question was not caused on or based on a false belief. But we also looked at the problems brought up by Carl Genet and Alvin Goldman, pictured over to your left. The problem is, there are some situations in which agents don't reason through beliefs at all. They don't do any inference making. They just have a perceptual experience and form a belief. For example, in the fake barn county example given by Genet and Goldman, a person just looks out at a barn and forms the belief that there's a barn. Or, to use another example, Roderick Chisholm had a sheepdog in a field that looked an awful lot like a sheep. And in that situation, an agent just forms a justified belief that there's a sheep in the field, and it turns out they were right all along. They just lacked knowledge in that case. So those are situations involving beliefs based strictly on perceptual experiences, not false premises or premises of any sort. Now, the no false belief solution, as intuitive as it is, may seem to provide a clue to solving the Gettier problem, but that may not be the case. We looked at an example brought up by Marshall Swain in which a couple got married a long time ago and then had, later on, an elaborate wedding ceremony. And an agent who saw the elaborate ceremony forms the belief that they just got married today. That's a false belief. But it seems like he knows that currently they are husband and wife, even though he started with a false premise. So what does that imply? We should form the conclusion that the JTB theory is not going to be remedied by appeals to false premises or lack thereof. We need to do something extra to the JTB theory if we're going to salvage it at all, and the preoccupation with whether or not false premises were involved is a non-starter. So let's take a look at some situations, or rather epistemologists, who have tried to remedy the problem in other ways. The first guy we're going to take a look at is this fellow, Fred Dretske, recently departed, may he rest in peace. He presents a solution that also seems kind of intuitive. His solution is that the reasons that the agents in question had for their beliefs simply were not strong enough. And I'm construing the term reasons here very broadly to include things like experiences, like perception, or things like that. On his conclusive reasons account, a subject knows that P is the case if JTB is satisfied, plus the subject had reasons, or a reason R, for the belief in P, such that if they had been wrong, if tilde P had been the case, then they wouldn't have had those reasons to believe with. Put formally, tilde P arrows to it wouldn't be the case that the subject had the reasons. And here the arrow is a counterfactual, involving the word would have, or what they would not have had. When you apply this to the previous cases, you can see that Fred Dretske can show you why our agents failed to have knowledge. Let's go back to Smith and Jones in the job hunt, for example. Now, in that example, Smith got some reasons based on perception. He saw 10 coins put in Jones's pocket. He had some reasons for his belief that the man who will get the job had 10 coins in his pocket. But suppose what I have here in the red cloud had turned out to be false. Now, would it have been the case that he still had his reasons, which I've depicted in the green cloud? Yeah, he surely would have. So the fourth condition brought up by Dretske here is not satisfied. If he had been wrong about what's in the red cloud, he would have still had his reasons in the green cloud. Or apply it to the Gettier case involving Smith and Jones in Barcelona. There, an agent had plenty of reasons, like his reasons for thinking that Jones did own a Ford, his past experience with Jones, and his knowledge about Jones's character, and those reasons I'll just put in a green cloud here so you can see it. He forms the belief that either Jones owns a Ford or he's in Barcelona. Now, if what's in this red cloud had actually turned out false, well, would he still have had his reasons? It seems like he would have. Once again, Dretske's fourth condition for knowledge is not satisfied. Or go back to Keith Lehrer's example of Nogot and Havit. Now, in that example, an employer gets a lot of evidence for the claim that one of his employees, specifically Nogot, owns a Ford. Now, ask yourself, if he had been wrong, and I'll put a little circle with a line through it over Havit and his Ford, if he had been wrong about that, would he have still had his reasons? Well, it seems to me like Nogot would have still been up to his old tricks. Yes, he would have still had the reasons. So once again, Dretske's conditions are not satisfied. A little less clear to me is the case of the fake Barn County example brought up by Goldman. Now, that's another case in which knowledge is supposed to fail to occur even despite the presence of a justified true belief. So let's bring our tourists in here. Now, assuming that they had been wrong about it being a real barn in front of them, would they have still had their reasons? Now, I'm going to stretch the example here a little bit, or maybe give my interpretation, but presumably, maybe they would have still had their reasons because maybe they'd have been seeing a papier-mâché barn, and maybe we construe their reasons to be that sort of experience of barnness out there in the field. So I'm going to let this example pass and draw the conclusion that Fred Dretske's conclusive reasons account does seem to give us a clear picture of why agents thus discussed have failed to have knowledge, despite the presence of a JTB. So what's wrong with this account? Well, there are some difficulties here. Problem number one, this conclusive reasons account requires reasons so strong that it seems to equate all knowledge with infallible knowledge. It looks like in order to have knowledge, what you have to be able to say is, I wouldn't have had these reasons for my beliefs at all unless I was right. And to say the least, that is a really high criterion for knowledge, which possibly leads to the conclusion that we don't know a whole lot at all. And the second problem, some people have alleged, is that the criterion is still too weak. There's not enough, even given this fourth condition for knowledge, to get a person knowledge. Marshall Swain has argued that this position is actually Gettierable itself. How do you like that word Gettierable? Just made that up. Well, here's my variation on a very popular example given by Gettier, or rather I should say given by Marshall Swain, as a Gettier problem. It involves hologram cups. Suppose my neighbor has a hologram projector that projects pictures of, well, any given thing. In this case, a picture of my cup on the table. Now let's say that Dretske comes along and he sees this hologram projection and he draws the conclusion that his cup is on the table. However, this hologram projector is connected to another projector that picks up images, and in this case it's picking up an image of the genuine cup on the table and projecting it over to the right. Now all this is going on behind, I'll just bring in some books here, it's going on behind the scenes so that Dretske doesn't know it's going on. So what's going on in this situation? Does Dretske really know there's a cup on his table? After all he saw was a cup facade, a hologram. Swain says he does not know. But notice, in this situation, it seems as though Dretske's condition for knowledge is satisfied. He wouldn't have had his reasons are, that is, the perceptual experience of a hologram cup, unless he'd been right about the cup. After all, that hologram is occurring simply in virtue of the fact through a long causal chain, it's picking up images of a genuine cup on the table. So, what are we going to say about this? Well, Fred Dretske has actually presented another solution to the problem that was presented by Gettier, one that's received a whole lot more attention. So let's take a look at his other solution. Now, Dretske has formed a position referred to as contextualism as a solution to the Gettier problem. Knowledge doesn't require you to have reasons strong enough to rule out far-fetched things like hologram cups or fake Barn County or all that sort of thing. What it requires is that you simply have good reasons for dismissing the relevant alternatives for why you have your reasons, experiences, etc. So, it doesn't require us to rule out hologram cups and fake barns, but well, what is relevant? What do you need to be able to rule out with good reason? And Dretske says, well, oftentimes that depends. After all, when we go back and look at some of our examples involving, for example, the employer who's dealing with Nogot here, how is he going to get enough evidence to rule out that he's being tricked elaborately? How often can he do that, and on the basis of what? Or going back to our fake barns example, how often do you really need just to form the belief that something's out in a field, like a barn? How often do you need to be able to rule out fakery, like fake barn county or something like that? And Dretske's answer is that when you consider situations like this, what becomes a relevant thing that you have to have reasons for ruling out often depends upon the context you're in. And context is defined here in terms of the skeptical challenges that are being currently entertained or currently raised. So, just to give you a clearer picture of what Dretske's talking about, let's use one of his illustrations. Suppose he goes to a zoo and he looks in a pen and he sees what appears to him to be a zebra, and off the basis of that perception, he says, yeah, there's a zebra in that pen. And some child that he's visiting the zoo with says, well, how do you know that's a zebra and not a painted mule? Well, Dretske says, before I'm asked, assuming that I'm right about the zebra, maybe I knew that it was a zebra, but afterwards, when I'm asked the question, is that a painted mule, I really have to ask myself, do I know or have the ability to discriminate between the two? So in that context, he's taking more skeptical possibilities into consideration, and afterwards, he possibly does not know what type of animal is in that pen. So critics of this view, critics of Dretske, said, well, apparently the more you care on this view, the less you know. That is, the more careful you are in forming your beliefs, the more care you take in entertaining skeptical alternatives to why you have your reasons, the harder it is to get knowledge. So this is a very interesting view, a very unique view on what knowledge requires. Now, just to get you thinking a little bit here, I want to point out that Dretske's fanciful example really could happen to you. Here's a story out of the Toronto Sun. It's no joke, people. Actually, out in Palestine, outside of Gaza, some zebras at a zoo had died of starvation, and so the zoo workers replaced them with, guess what? Painted donkeys. And I'll go ahead and bring up some pictures here for you. Take a look. Wouldn't you have confused these for zebras? I know I would have. And some of these children looking at these painted donkeys probably can't tell the difference between a zebra and a painted donkey. So maybe you should ask yourself next time you go to a zoo whether or not the zookeepers there are playing a trick on you, similar to what happened here in Palestine. I like this last picture of the child dealing with his zebra/painted donkey. Looks to me like he's getting a little bit too close to the business end of that donkey, if you ask me. So let's summarize things here quickly. Dretske's new solution to the Gettier problem is still a contender in the field. People do wonder if maybe, after all, whether or not knowledge obtains is sensitive to context. We're going to go ahead and discuss this example again, or Fred Dretske's position, when we bring up the topic of skepticism and skeptical hypotheses. But for now, I want to move on to another possible solution to the Gettier problem. This is the causal condition solution brought up by Alvin Goldman, or actually popularized, fine-tuned, and made famous by him. And on this view, knowledge requires JTB plus, instead, that the belief that P was caused by the fact that P. The truth of your belief has to give rise to your belief itself. Take a look at the example that we gave from Keith Lehrer, in which an agent comes to believe that one of his employees owns a Ford. Was that caused by the fact that an employee owned a Ford? No, it wasn't. It was caused by the fact that one of his employees tried to pull a trick on him. So Goldman can give you a reason as to why knowledge did not obtain in that case. The belief was improperly caused. Or if you go to the example brought up by Gettier, was the fact that the man who will get the job had 10 coins in his pocket the cause of Smith's belief that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket? No, it was caused instead by some facts he knew about Smith, and Smith did not get the job at all. So you got another example of Goldman getting the right solution. In addition to the one that we already discussed, in which Havit having the car was not really the cause of the employer's belief that one of his employees owns a Ford. We got to get the causal connections right. Now here's another example we discussed earlier, the hologram cups example. Was the fact that the cup was on the table the cause of the agent's belief that there was a cup on the table? Well, this is a little tricky, and I'm going to have to go iffy here. It looks like initially what you want to say is that the real cause of this belief that I've depicted in the red was a hologram. But you may say indirectly there was some causal link up between the cup being on the table and the hologram to which it gave rise. I'm going to have to set this example to the side, but maybe Alvin Goldman gets the right solution. One place where he clearly has trouble, though, his own example involving barns. So suppose this couple is driving through fake barn county and they look out there and see a nice barn. Was their belief that that's a nice barn caused by a nice barn? In the story as we depicted it, yeah, it was. But I thought this was a situation where knowledge was not supposed to occur. So Goldman knew early on that his own counterexample would cause some trouble for this particular theory of knowledge. So we're going to have to try and revise it. And you need to think to yourself, maybe this whole appeal to causation is, well, off course to begin with. I'll just give you an example. Suppose somebody gets a blow to the head by a rolling pin that just causes them to suddenly start believing things. They start to believe the Cubs won the World Series or that they're bulletproof, but they also come to believe that they've been hit with a rolling pin. Is this sort of causation the type of thing that gains epistemic status for this belief? Is the belief that I've been hit with a rolling pin suddenly better or more of a candidate for knowledge simply because it was caused by the fact that he was hit by a rolling pin? Well, here's what Goldman proposes. What we really need is the criterion that knowledge requires JTB plus the belief that P being properly caused by the fact that P. Now, what does this notion of proper causation include? Well, to block his own fake barns example and the rolling pin example I just gave, early on he had to say that the causal conditions in the environment have to be roughly as the agent assumes. It can't be a deceptive environment like fake barn county or some sort of unreliable environment like one in which you get blows to the head. So, this criterion seems to get him around some problems, yet not all of them. He knows that there are remaining problems. For example, what about future facts? Can future facts, which I presume to know, cause my present beliefs? I believe the sun will rise tomorrow. I believe that I will die one day. But why do I believe those things? It's not these facts which cause my present beliefs. Rather, what's causing my present beliefs is knowledge of the past or my involvement causally with past conditions on Earth. And what about generalizations? Is my belief that all golden spheres are less than 1 mile in diameter caused by the fact that all golden spheres are so? No, they're caused instead by my interactions with gold here on planet Earth and the fact that there hasn't been a whole lot of gold that I've seen. So, what we have to say is this causal condition needs to be developed. Now, Hilary Kornblith, pictured over here to your left, gives a brief but masterful summary as to how Goldman developed and articulated his position. He initially proposed that knowledge that P is properly analyzed as belief that P caused by the fact that P. So, to know there's a table in front of you, the table has to cause that belief. But then Goldman revised and developed his account in a later article, Discrimination and Perceptual Knowledge, identifying perceptual knowledge with true belief that's the product of a discriminatory capacity. Now, on that view, to know there's a table in front of you, you have to be able to discriminate when there is and isn't such a table. But this account was then further developed, pay attention here to readers, to provide an account of justified belief in what is justified belief. First thing I want you to notice here, Goldman started to, instead of adding to the JTB theory, he just revised the J in the theory, and he radically revised it. Now J, the knowledge maker, amounts to this: the belief is justified just in case it's the product of a psychological process, emphasis on the word process, which tends, that means statistically or probabilistically, to produce true beliefs. Now, with this particular account of justification and knowledge on hand, you can see how Goldman's going to solve the problems that we just raised. How can future facts cause my present beliefs? The new solution is, well, to get knowledge of future facts, you don't need that. What you need is some sort of reliable process, like an inductive, as philosophers call it, or probability-based reasoning process from the past to the future. Don't make it like a process of, hasty generalizations, but a reliable process where you take in your data from the past and reliably infer carefully to future events. And what about generalizations? Once again, there's some sort of process that we engage in from which we reason from what we've seen to situations we haven't seen yet in order to draw generalizations. And presuming that those processes that we involve ourselves in are reliable, then Goldman says you are justified and possibly in the possession of knowledge under those circumstances. Now, this account, called Processes Reliabilism, is pretty controversial. There's at least one philosopher out there, a lot more than that, I will assure you, Lawrence Bonger, who says that this is not a good account of justification and consequently not a good account of knowledge. He gives the example of the reliable clairvoyant. Suppose I have reliable, that is, powers that are statistically reliable, they tend to give me true belief, of clairvoyance. But I don't have any proof that I have this, and on this basis of this process, I come to believe correctly that the president's in New York. Problem is, all the media that I've been hearing says that he's in Washington, D.C., or, well, they present information to the contrary. On this view, do I know that he was in New York? Well, Bonger says this situation involves a person, the clairvoyant, myself, who is unjustified in the belief that the president's in New York. I should have been going with the evidence given by the media instead. Now, if Bonger is right, then Goldman's account is in trouble, but Bonger's opinion on this is not uncontroversial. Feldman, for example, in his textbook, thinks that the example is unclear. Maybe Goldman's account of justification survives this attack. So I'm going to move on to discuss, when it comes to processes reliabilism, what is the biggest objection out there to the view. This is sometimes called the Generality Objection, which we'll have to discuss later on. But basically, the problem is that when it comes to any one process, like, well, say perception, or in some of the examples I gave earlier, the process of inductive or probability-based reasoning, it seems like these processes can generate either justified or unjustified beliefs. But Goldman has an account where it just delivers one or the other. Take Mr. Magoo here, for example. When you look at him examining through his faulty little eyesight an animal, maybe he's justified in thinking it's an animal, less justified in thinking it's a goat, and maybe his perceptual experience is not enough to give him a justified belief that it's a two-horned goat, given the eyesight that he has. And you might even start to wonder exactly what process is Mr. Magoo using here. Is it perception alone, or is he doing some sort of inference making along the way as well? It's really unclear, says Feldman. The problem is there's so many different ways to characterize the process involved that you can say a different process is involved in any particular case, and that makes the theory in question objectionably vague. As a result, it's not spelled out well enough to give you an evaluation of it. To go back to some of Feldman's examples, let's talk about the baseball umpire, for example. Suppose he's calling balls and strikes, and in any given situation, there's going to be some clear calls and some tough calls, but it seems like, if assuming that the umpire is using the same so-called process every single time, that Goldman has to say that all of his calls are either equally justified or equally unjustified, and that's a bad result. Can you even say in any given situation what process is being involved? For example, when you go out in the woods, is the process by which you come to believe that that over there is a tree the same one that causes you to think it's a maple tree? I don't really know. Maybe the process by which I come to think it's a tree is just the process of perception, and maybe it's a maple tree involves perception with some inference skills and some memories that I have of maple trees. So as you think about those examples, says Feldman, you should start to see that critics and defenders of reliabilism are just making up for each case a description of the so-called process that gets them the result they want, and that there's really no general theory here. This is a tough objection, and we'll return to it later. In the meantime, I'm just going to present another possible way of trying to eliminate the Gettier problem. So to discuss this last theory, I'm going to have to bring up the concept of defeasibility or epistemic defeat. I'm going to bring in a guy here who's looking at a red paper and forms the belief on the basis of perception that, yeah, it's a red paper. But what if he comes to know or comes to understand or believe that there's some sort of red light being shined on the paper that he didn't notice before that makes any paper look red, regardless of its color? Does he know it's a red paper now? Well, it seems like once he discovers the presence of that light is there, he needs to withhold from this belief. It's been defeated. In what sense is it defeated? Well, here's the three things that are pretty uncontroversial about defeaters. Defeaters of this sort are potential irrationality makers. In other words, if he comes to discover that there's this red light involved, he's irrational if he persists in his belief that it's a red paper. He needs to give up that belief to some extent on pain of irrationality until he does some more research. And if you have a defeater like this, it defeats both justification for your belief and knowledge. Initially, you may say he was justified in thinking it was a red paper. After he has the defeater, no, he is not justified, and he doesn't know what color the paper really is. And here's an important point. There may be defeaters out there for your beliefs before you actually, quote-unquote, have them. Maybe the defeater for his belief was there all along, but only becomes an irrationality maker for him. He only has the defeater once he discovers facts about that red light. Now, if you've got the concept of defeat and defeasibility underneath your belt, we're prepared to discuss Gilbert Harman's solution to the Gettier problem. I'm going to give you an example that's sometimes called Harman's false report. Now, here we're going to bring in an agent, Jill, who gets, and I'll put some emphasis on this, a reliable report of a political leader's assassination. Notice, I'm putting his view in contrast with the process's reliabilism view that we discussed earlier. Despite her getting a reliable report and perhaps having a reliable process of information gathering and belief formation here, the government has spread through all the other media outlets a false report to cover up the assassination. Now, she doesn't know about these other false reports, so does she know, given that she was only in contact with the reliable report, that the political leader was genuinely assassinated? Now, here we have a situation in which a defeater is out there potentially. If she had known about all the other media sources, well, then she should probably refrain from her belief as to what happened to the leader. So, what's happening here? Harman says this: it's highly implausible that she should know facts about the political leader simply because she lacks evidence which everyone else has. Why is that? She's getting knowledge out of ignorance. She's getting knowledge on that view because she's ignorant of all the defeaters out there. There is a defeater out there for her belief, although technically she doesn't have it yet because she doesn't know about these other media sources and what they're reporting. So, Harman proposes this: one knows only if there's no evidence out there, discovered or not, such that if one knew about the evidence, one would not be justified in believing one's conclusions. Now, if you accept Harman's account of what's going on here, he can give you some illumination on what happened in the other Gettier problems. Why didn't Smith know that the man who will get the job had 10 coins in his pocket? Because he should have refrained from that belief if he had known about the defeater, that Jones was actually going to get the job, he himself, rather than Smith. And after all, he had never checked his pocket to see what was inside of it or not inside of it. Or let's go back to the Smith and Jones in Barcelona. Now, should Smith have refrained from his belief that either Jones owns a Ford or he's in Barcelona? Well, he should have refrained from that if only he had known about the defeater, namely that Jones has no Ford and that Jones is currently driving a rental. And what about the defeater in Keith Lehrer's Nogot and Havit case? Well, if only this employer had known that Nogot was faking the evidence, then he should have refrained from his belief that one of his employees owns a Ford, even if that belief later on was right after all. Fake Barn County? A nice solution from Harman here. If you had known that you were driving through Fake Barn County, then obviously you would have been irrational to persist in your belief as to what and was and was not a barn and a field in front of you. And the same point holds in Roderick Chisholm's sheepdog example. You get a justified true belief, but if only you had known about the evidence that you are looking in fact at a sheepdog instead of a real sheep, then clearly you should have refrained from your belief as to whether or not the field had a sheep in it. I could go on here, folks. Harman gives you a nice solution to the hologram cups example. Maybe in this example, when Dretske's looking at this cup on, or what seems to be a cup on the table, if he had only known that there was a hologram projector that was projecting images around the house, he should have refrained from whether or not there was a cup on the table, his cup in particular. So this defeasibility requirement and the defeasibility solution to the Gettier problem seems to get a lot of right answers to these questions, but here's some objections for you. Does knowledge in this case become a matter of luck? Is that an objection, you think? So how do you know what defeaters are and are not out there? It's really largely out of your control, isn't it? Let me give you an example that has been much discussed in the literature. maybe this defeasibility criterion is just way too strong. For example, if I'm at the library and I see somebody, call him Tom Grabbit, who grabs a book in the library and runs with it without checking it out, then I seem to be justified in my belief that Tom Grabbit is a thief. But suppose, unbeknownst to me, he's got a mother out there, Miss Grabbit, who believes that Tom is indistinguishable from his twin John. Now, if she honestly believes that, whether I know she believes it or not, then if only I had known she held those beliefs, I should probably refrain from my belief that Tom Grabbit's a thief. I should say, well, for all I know, it could be John instead. Now, let me add another element to this story. Further, let's suppose that Tom's mother is insane. There is no such person as John. John is a figment of her imagination. Now, should the simple fact that she holds the belief that there are twin brothers out there be a defeater for me? Well, if it is, it's a misleading defeater. I was probably right all along that Tom Grabbit was a thief. But do I lack knowledge here? Well, this is the point, and different philosophers have come to different conclusions. Feldman apparently thinks that, yeah, you do have a defeater there. If only you had known about this mother's beliefs about twins and such was out there, well, you should have refrained from your belief, but Feldman's conclusion is that doesn't matter. You're lucky not to know about this mother's beliefs, insane as they are, and perhaps I think on Feldman's view you had knowledge after all. Keith Lehrer, on the other hand, says, well, maybe we should try to disqualify the mom's belief as a defeater for me. Why is that? Well, as you may suspect, says Poyman, the defeasibility criterion is vague and open-ended. There's a large number of knowledge claims. In this situation, my claim that Tom Grabbit's a thief, for which you can imagine some true proposition such that if you believed it, it'd defeat your claim to knowledge, but then you can think of some further true belief, like maybe the belief that the mother is insane, that would defeat the defeater. And then maybe there's some other true belief that would defeat the anti-defeater, and so on. So you may suspect that this condition that Harman is proposing really appeals to omniscience. Nonetheless, many epistemologists, such as Lehrer and Paxson, believe that we can distinguish between defeating and non-defeating conditions. And by the way, I'm a little skeptical as to whether or not that can possibly be defended. But there are others, like Gilbert Harman himself, who think that the best we can do is set forth a requirement that if a person's justified in inferring or thinking that there's no defeating counter-evidence to a true justified belief, defeating counter-evidence out there waiting to be discovered, he's saying, then that person knows the proposition in question. I'll tell you what, folks, this is a tough criterion to spell out, but the conclusions I'm going to just draw from this lecture are that the front runners for a solution to the Gettier problem are contextualism, a la Dretske, the processes reliabilism of Goldman, and this defeasibility account brought up by Gilbert Harman. These are tough positions to articulate and to defend, and I brought up some counterexamples proposed to them. And we haven't canvassed everything out there. Coming up soon, I'll discuss Alvin Plantinga's reformed epistemology and his approach to the problem, and Nozick's truth tracker theory. But before we do that, I'm going to skip on to the subject of skepticism and see how each of these views that we've just discussed may or may not solve the problem of skepticism and whether we have knowledge at all. So I encourage you guys to keep working at it. You've done some tough work so far, and I sense that those